Welcome to World War II Indiana Landmarks, Episode 6, the Naval Air Station, Bunker Hill. I'm your host, Ron May, author of the book World War II Indiana Landmarks. For today's episode, we move to a site just north of Kokomo, the town of Bunker Hill. It is 8 miles south of Peru, Indiana. Following the attack at Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entrance into the war, the Department of the Navy scrambled to identify sites and build air stations across the country to train aviation cadets for the war effort. The Navy Air Station Bunker Hill became one of 24 such stations built during 1942 and 1943. It became a primary training base, offering cadets their first experiences flying planes. Some 2,000 acres of prime farmland in north-central Indiana along Highway 31, 18 miles north of Kokomo and 7 miles south of Peru, were selected by Navy officials in February 1942 for the new air station. The plans for the air station called for 4 runways of 5,000 feet and space for 1,200 aviation students and 1,500 base personnel. Building the air station required 64 landowners to sell their property to the U.S. government. The location offered exactly what Navy planners were looking for: flat topography to build runways, low population density, significant distance away from other airports, access to railroad lines, and proximity to other key Midwestern cities like Chicago, Detroit, Cincinnati, and Indianapolis. Just 7 months after the events at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Naval Reserve Aviation Base Peru was commissioned on July 1, 1942. The training plane used most often at the primary flight training bases was the N2S-3 cadet biplane, also known as a Stearman, shown parked on the tarmac in the photo. Over 400 of these planes were used at the Naval Air Station Bunker Hill during the peak of training. The plane had an open cockpit with 2 seats, one for an instructor and the other the student. It was built by Boeing Stearman. It was the entry-level plane for cadets in both the Army Air Forces and the Navy as they began flying. While the aviation cadets spent many hours in the biplanes, the flight instructors had even more time in them. Joseph Edward Durnan Sr., in the photo above, was one of those instructors. While Durnan undoubtedly had some favorite cadets, he held one student in his highest esteem: Boston Red Sox star baseball player Ted Williams. Williams, at left, along with fellow ball player Johnny Pesky in the middle, volunteered for service in the Navy and arrived at Naval Air Station Bunker Hill in September 1943. The duo had earned number 1 and number 2 hitting records in 1942 in the American League. Both Williams and Pesky were 2 of Durnan's first cadets to instruct. He was the best flyer he ever met, Durnan said of Williams in a conversation with his children years later. Great hand and eye coordination. Both Williams and Pesky were popular during their 12 weeks at Bunker Hill, and both, although wealthy sports stars by this point, acted like regular guys. They put their baseball skills to good use in the planes and while playing on the Navy baseball team together at Bunker Hill. Williams went on to serve as a fighter pilot in the Pacific Theater, while Pesky was stationed at the naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Both Williams and Pesky survived their war service. Following the end of the war, they returned to baseball and the Red Sox. Williams, the batter in this photo, and Pesky played in the 1946 World Series, which they lost to the St. Louis Cardinals. Williams returned to military service during the Korean War and flew as a Marine Corps pilot. His friendship with his former instructor, Joe Durnan, pictured at right, lasted for the rest of Durnan's life. Williams often purchased tickets for Joe Durnan to attend games when the Red Sox played at Yankee Stadium, near where Durnan lived in southeast Pennsylvania. While most of the aviation students lacked the legendary status of professional baseball players, all the Navy cadets who trained at Bunker Hill were stars for their courageous service. And tragically, some of those stars died during their training. 9 cadets perished in plane crashes during their time at Bunker Hill. 6 of the fatalities occurred in 1943, and another 3 in 1944. Each accident was a sad reminder of the inherent danger of students and instructors taking to the sky to train for aerial warfare. By the end of March 1945, some 5,997 American cadets had begun their primary training at Naval Air Station Bunker Hill. 6 months later, in the fall of 1945, the beehive of training stopped almost as quickly as it had started. At war's end, the Naval Air Station Bunker Hill was quickly decommissioned. As of 2022, you could still see the air control tower standing. The building, however, was imploding and was scheduled for demolition later that year. There are still a few buildings left from the former Bunker Hill Naval Air Station that are used today. This is one of them, here housing offices in the Grissom Redevelopment Authority. In 1954, 8 years after the base's closing, the Air Force took control of the former Naval Air Station at Bunker Hill. Initially, it was called the Bunker Hill Air Force Base, but the name was changed in 1968 to Grissom Air Force Base in memory of native Hoosier astronaut Virgil Gus Grissom, who was a veteran flyer in both World War II and Korea, and lost his life in 1967 while serving as pilot of Apollo 1. In 1994, the base became an Air Force Reserve Station, and its name was tweaked to Grissom Air Reserve Base. It continues in that capacity today and is home to a KC-135R Stratotanker wing in the Air Force Reserve. On the north side of the reserve base is the Grissom Air Museum, which opened in 1987. 20 historic aircraft are displayed in a large outdoor area in front of the museum, including a World War II-era B-25 bomber. By climbing the steps of the old observation tower, one can take in a panoramic view of all the planes and see in the distance the area that once was the Navy Air Station at Bunker Hill and later became an Air Force base. As I mentioned, one of those aircraft on display is a B-25 bomber used during World War II. Inside the museum, there are many interesting displays and artifacts from the base's early history as a naval air station to its more recent history as an Air Force and now Air Force Reserve installation. The museum is well worth a visit. Learn more about the history of the Naval Air Station Bunker Hill, Grissom Air Museum, and the stories of those who served in my new book, World War II Indiana Landmarks, available for purchase on my website or wherever books are sold. And while on my website, check out my trilogy of Indiana World War II veteran service stories. Thanks for tuning in to this episode.